Good morning, everybody. Thank you to Bill and to James and for everybody that helped in the organization of this conference. I was talking with Roger a short while ago, and he said he was feeling some melancholy about the end of the day. So it is with one drooping and one auspicious eye that we arrive at this point. But we made it. Right? We got through, we survived, we succeeded. My name is James Reich. I am not related to my subject in any way. In A Saturday Afternoon from Black Spring, Henry Miller evokes the public urinals of modernist Paris. Our flaneur drifts into one of them to relieve himself. Within the decorative confines of one of these 19th century micturation stations, with their vaguely military insinuations, these, as it were, armored biological checkpoints, Miller cuts a narrow figure behind the metal. Peering out from inside this zoetrope of ammonia and rust, encircled in what he understands to be the illusion of privacy, inconspicuous and yet over-conspicuous, both voyeur and object of voyeurism, he unzips, takes his cock, and pisses a stream that might flow out of the zoetrope toward the spectator. Pissing as spectacle, a holding forth of energized flesh, and thus Miller holds forth. One likes to piss in sunlight, among human beings who watch and smile down at you. No man with any feeling can deny that the sight of the male standing behind a tin strip and looking out at the throng with that contented, easy, vacant smile, that long, reminiscent, pleasurable look in his eye, is a good thing. To relieve a full bladder is one of the greatest human joys. And as Camus put it, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. The psychologist Wilhelm Reich would have understood this. For the bladder, bounded and chastised by armor, was one of Reich's metaphors in his extension of Freud's beyond the pleasure principle. Reich describes the neurotic. The picture of the human character as an armor around the core of such a living organism was extremely significant. If such a bladder were put into an unresolvable condition of tension and it could express itself, it would complain. Rendered helpless, it would seek the causes of its suffering outside itself and make reproaches. It would beg to be pricked open. It would provoke its surroundings until it believed it had reached its goal. And Reich continues, the neurotic organism could be readily compared to such a simple system as that of a taut and at the same time peripherally armored bladder. And this was Reich in the early 1930s. With totalitarianism and Hitler ascendant, Reich published two of his great works in 1933, Character Analysis and The Mass Psychology of Fascism. And he barely escaped fascism and arrived in the United States in 1940. Reich saw neurotic symptoms in physical symptoms like muscular tension, rigidity, or armoring, and thus arose his treatment of the total biopathic organism, not merely the psyche as a discrete problem. Character is expressed in the affect of total organism, not only by verbal, moral analysis. And there's Henry Miller, experiencing that greatest of human joys of pissing en plein air, albeit with peripheral armor, seeking out the causes of his suffering, provoking his surroundings, and finding relief. This is a prescription for healthy living. In an open letter to all and sundry, Miller even says of his watercolors, I cannot tell you the pleasure I get when I go to the bathroom, as we say in America, to see one of my masterpieces staring me in the face. Only lately, while making PP, Shea Walter Arensberg, the most interesting collector of modern art in America, I discovered some very inspiring art products. So don't think when you relegate one of my masterpieces to the water closet that you do me an injury. On the contrary, I shall consider it a great honor. So Reich's analogy of the bladder would lead to his notorious and notoriously misunderstood theory of the orgasm or the orgasm formula. Mechanical tension, bioelectric charge, bioelectric discharge, mechanical relaxation. Ironically, this is also the classic ejaculatory formula of the story or the novel, according to Gustav Freytag, whose pyramid of rising tension and climax, followed by denouement, has been erected upon thousands of creative writing syllabi. To set fucking as the surface of the novel, as Miller did, is perhaps merely to be honest about its underlying structure. Anyway, Freud's conception of pleasure, unpleasure would, in Reich, become an observable biopsychic formula of tension and relaxation, and eventually from orgasm to a cosmology of orgone energy, rainfall, radiation, environmental crisis, and flying saucers. By the mid-50s, he was both a folk devil and a cult figure, even as, or in part because, he was languishing in prison. The figure that Miller and Reich share of a point of admiration is D.H. Lawrence, of whom Miller said he burned so vividly, and intensely that he left no ash. I don't want this to be a parlor game of correspondences. All three were amateur painters, responding to energy more than technique. All three were regarded as obscene. Reich's diagnosis of the emotional plague afflicting mass society compared with Miller's air-conditioned nightmare, etc. Reich, Miller, and Lawrence gather at crucifixion as a transpersonal motif. Reich was a weather prophet. But it's a game that can be played over a drink or three. Lawrence's psychological theories were published in Psychoanalysis and the Unconscious and Fantasia of the Unconscious in 1921 and 1922, shortly after Reich met Freud in Vienna. Lawrence, like Miller, like Reich, was concerned with the primal. Lawrence identified the center of dynamic consciousness in the solar plexus. He says, at the solar plexus, the dynamic knowledge is this, that I am I. The solar plexus is the center of all the sympathetic system. The great prime knowledge is sympathetic in nature. I am I, in vital centrality. I am I, the vital center of all things. I am I, the clue to the whole. All is one with me. It is, then, identity. The solar plexus was for Reich the seat and engine of emotions also. In character analysis, one of Reich's patients excuses herself to go to the bathroom, of course. Reich waits anxiously as her return takes some time. The young woman has made a cut in the skin about 10 centimeters long across the region of the solar plexus beneath the sternum. She said, "It is here where I feel the strongest emotions." The following session, she's added to the cut to make a crucifix. Mary Dearborn's great biography of Miller cites a 1970 interview with Playboy. The difference between me and other writers is that they struggle to get down what they've got up here in the head. I struggle to get down what's below in the solar plexus, in the nether regions. So this discussion of bladders, and tension and release, orgasms in the solar plexus draws Miller, Reich together. It is the background against which, shortly before Reich's death, Norman Mailer could declare in The White Negro that the intellectual antecedents of this generation can be traced to such separate influences as Henry Miller, D.H. Lawrence, and Wilhelm Reich. And all of Reich's experimental research was haunted. The specters with which he contended included Nazis, communists, or red fascists, he called them, totalitarians of all stripes, orthodox Freudians, orthodox scientists, conservatives, the radicals who distorted his work even as they defended it, animists, mysticists, UFOs, the FBI, and eventually the FDA, who burned his work in an industrial incinerator. Reich died of heart failure as an inmate of Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in 1957, age 60. One of the cardinal moments in Reich's downfall, from Freud's heir apparent to victim of the only book burning of its kind on American soil, is the effect of his reputation of a 1947 magazine article by Mildred E. Brady. Mildred E. Brady looks exactly what you think Mildred E. Brady would look like. Okay. Entitled The New Cult of Sex and Anarchy, and its considerably more aggressive sequel, which really turned the screw on Reich. The New Cult of Sex and Anarchy was published by Harper's, a magazine like The New Yorker that still festoons the toilet cistern in many an American bathroom. James Strick, one of Reich's biographers, refers to Mildred Brady as a muckraking journalist with Stalinist ties. And there's some evidence that Reich shared this opinion. Regardless, in the constellation of Miller, Reich, and D.H. Lawrence, Mildred was there early and often, a decade before Mailer and 30 years before English readers would find it repeated by Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari in Anti-Oedipus. Whence did Mildred Brady perceive this new cult of sex and anarchy on the West Coast, this flow toward apparent isolation of literary immigrants and sentimental mystics? That story begins, she says, with the arrival of Henry Miller in the Big Sur sometime late 1943. Miller unpacked the canned goods, wool scarves, pants, and ties that he had successfully panhandled through the New Republic's letters column and settled down in a cabin. Miller created quite a stir when he settled among us. The little magazines of the West, and there are more of them than you might imagine, hailed his coming in extravagant terms. Brady also, she freelanced in the New Republic. So she goes on, unaware, of course, of future ironies, including mystics and the town of Waco. He was welcomed in Motive, then published in Waco, Texas, believe it or not, she says, not only as the greatest living American writer, but as a great mystic, philosopher, and human being. Not long after his appearance on the coast, his books turned up in local bookshops with whole windows given over to them, and the young surrealist anarchist writers and hangers-on were called, for a time, Millerites. For the sentimental mystics and literary immigrants that she describes, the ultimate authority is no longer Freud or Jung, who stands high nevertheless, but one who, in his own words, wears the mantle of Freud. Wilhelm Reich, whose Function of the Orgasm is probably the most widely read and frequently quoted contemporary writing in this group. Even at the poetry reading sessions, you're likely to find someone carrying around a volume of his turgid and pretentious prose. Reich was in fact vehemently anti-mystical. Mysticism was that which mediated and interrupted experience and thus degraded it. And forms of immanence and transcendence have been discussed in these last few days. As for anarchism, for Brady, Mildred Brady, the genealogy of the anarchists' wing is one of refugees adrift after Kenneth Rexroth's split with San Francisco communism not long before the arrival of Miller and his psychic iconography. Around Rexroth, as around Miller, there collected a group of young intellectuals and writers who met weekly in self-education sessions, including reading the journals of the English anarchists, studying the old-line anarchist philosophers like Kropotkin, and leavening the politics liberally with psychoanalytic interpretations of Reich. It is, however, a decidedly literary group in which politics is all but submerged by art, where poems, not polemics, are written, and where D.H. Lawrence outshines Bakunin. Lawrence, the philosopher of Fantasia and the unconscious, rather than Lawrence, the novelist. Brady does somewhat quietly admit that Reich was no mystic and that Miller was too much the individual, so far on the lonely individualistic trail as to sneer at even anarchist organizations, she says. Brady, whose byline in Harper's says that she has observed at close range the groups of whom she writes, although we don't know if this was upwind or downwind of the cultists, uses the presence of conscientious objectors, sexual inequality, the glorification of the instincts and urges, as she puts it, and a vague collectivism reminiscent, as Brady saw it, of pre-Hitlerian bohemianism in Germany to suggest a reason why the new scene might be termed neo-fascist, something that she's content to wind up and let go, just saying. Perhaps she is as frustrated with Miller, largely at fault for all of this sex and anarchy on our western shore, as Orwell had been when he visited him in Paris and gave him an ambivalent kicking in his essay Inside the Whale. Orwell praised Miller's literary courage, but he was disappointed, as others have noted, in Miller's sort of mystical acceptance. Only what is he accepting, Orwell asks. In the first place, not America, but the ancient bone heap of Europe, where every grain of soil has passed through innumerable bodies. Secondly, not an epoch of expansion and liberty, but an epoch of fear, tyranny, and regimentation. To say, I accept, in an age like ours, is to say that you accept concentration camps, rubber truncheons, Hitler, Stalin, bombs, aeroplanes, tin food, machine guns, putschs, purges, slogans, Bedo belts, gas masks, submarines, spies, provocateurs, press censorship, secret prisons, aspirins, it's quite a list, Hollywood films, and political murders. Not only these things, of course, but those things among others, and on the whole, this is Henry Miller's attitude. Now, I suspect that Orwell's fear was that, as Winston Smith would in a future novel, Miller might have won the victory over himself. And perhaps he had in his own way. Perhaps Orwell saw Miller's acceptance in those same terms. Orwell stressed the importance of facing unpleasant facts, but it may be that Orwell forgot this maxim in his anxiety about Miller's acceptance of things. Was Miller not, in his own way, facing unpleasant facts, but not only unpleasant facts? One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Another English down-and-out, Colin Wilson, the accidental member of Britain's 1956 Angry Young Men and proponent of the new existentialism, met Miller in the early 1960s. Wilson, who would later write a biography of Reich declaring him insane, was visiting Christopher Isherwood in Pacific Palisades and eager to meet Miller. Wilson suggested that they meet at Isherwood's, and for his part, Isherwood was bereft to receive a call from that dreadful bore Henry Miller, who was on his way over. Eventually, the three of them adjourned to Aldous Huxley's home, where Wilson recalls Miller's kind of puppy vitality, like a friendly puppy. Miller attempted to correct Wilson for his head knowledge and pointed to his solar plexus as the source of inspiration. Vainly, Wilson would later write that Miller would probably be remembered as the only major writer of the 20th century who had nothing to say. I think Miller knew his distinction between head knowledge and the nether regions was a false one, as is his notion that it is in being of the earth that makes him inhuman. On the contrary, the moments of biophilia, innate affinity for the natural world, it's in those moments that he may be most human. Perhaps this insistence on the solar plexus in Miller, in Reich, and in Lawrence can give us something against the artificial head knowledge of artificial intelligence. For the robot will never know the relief of a full bladder, the orgasm, or the sublime. These and the uncanny are physical and psychic experiences. To call the sublime or the uncanny or epiphany areas of study for psychology, but to ignore their physical expression in shivers, chills, tears of joy, the strike of awe, is to miss the point. Miller accepted that the greatest of human joys comes at the urgent cost of a full bladder. Pleasure with unpleasure, as Freud had it. Mechanical tension before bioelectric discharge, as Reich would have it. To the extent that we face a resurgent animism in electronic spaces, we might take up Reich's anti-animism in that context and anti-mysticism. Each in his way, Miller and Reich call for a return to embodiment, a return to biopsychic essence, even as both men are sometimes perceived as mystics or pornographic weirdos. The counterculture still struggles to embrace their contradictions. Mainstream culture would rather not try. I think both knew if Europe was, or America is, a bone heap, those bones were not always only bones but vital things. Today one could lament those seduced by artificial intelligence, cheating art of the earthy and trickster danger Lorca called duende, but they were lost a long time ago or were never with us. Fuck 'em. To live authentically requires a certain virtuosity. Within involuntary, natural, and coerced tension, we should seek the causes of our suffering. make reproaches, even if we can only object conscientiously or privately. We must provoke our surroundings with unpublishable words, with all that is brilliant, obscene, contradictory, abject, difficult, and numinous. And here is a declaration of deeply unfashionable authenticity with unapologetic human virtuosity.